G'day guys, welcome back to True Eagle. We're going to talk a little bit more about this trade period, as you'd probably expect, because it's about to kick off. And just a little bit of another tidbit we've got about the Eagles here with respect to pick 3. So this isn't necessarily linked to a player trade. An article today came out on the AFL website that hinted at the possibility that the Eagles are looking at trading 3 down this draft. So it's not necessarily linked to the Liam Baker thing. Obviously it could be. What we're going to do in this video is kind of explore some options and the pros and cons and how we could benefit from trading down pick 3. We'll explore a few different ideas I've got. I'm trying to be pragmatic, and with these, forecasted trades, these aren't necessarily things that I'm campaigning for or wanting. And that's been the theme of a lot of videos I've done so far on this channel. I'm trying to do it with a slightly negative lens. Maybe a little bit of that is just managing my own expectations, but trying to be realistic so we can know what to expect. So I'm going to do the same thing in this video, come up with a few ideas of what I think is a fair and equitable trade for both teams, as opposed to just idealistic best case scenario stuff. So with that in mind, we're going to explore some options, and at the end of it, we can be like, no, all of that is shithouse. So let's refer to this article here. It says on the AFL website, North Melbourne's number 2 pick and West Coast number 3 selection are on the table as trade chips as clubs contemplate moves up the draft board. The Eagles have placed pick 3 in the trade mix, with a number of clubs eyeing ways to include the selection as part of deals that send players different ways, with Gold Coast having pick 6 on the table for Daniel Rioli and the out-of-contract Baker wanting to join the Eagles. Again, I'm just reading all of this. The possibility of pick 3 being involved in a mix that would see the Eagles get a pick go back their way and be able to land Baker has also been raised. So that is obviously sort of suggesting it might be embroiled in the Richmond one, and Richmond would be a serious contender given all the picks that they have for a team for us to trade with, given we're already dealing with them this trade period. However, we'll get into this, I've got a few other options of clubs that could potentially be in that mix. It says, but other avenues to split the pick into multiple choices also exist, particularly with the Eagles set on pick 14 from the Hawks coming back their way as part of the Tom Barrass deal. Okay, so this article is completely absent outside of the implication that Richmond would be a genuine suitor for them. Outside of that, it doesn't name any teams. However, I've just gone through all the different draft hands and highlighted a few teams that actually have the capital to get this done, and whether or not they have the motivation to is a secondary thing. So we'll go through those options one by one and come up with a few mock ideas for trades. And but I suppose before that, I do want to talk a little bit about this draft and the prospect of trading out of the top 3 selections. So generally speaking, I think we have done fairly well with pick splitting in the past. I think we did well in 22. I've said this before. Getting Jinby and Hewitt, I think, made sense at the time. In 2023, I think it made more sense to hold the pick. Maybe I'm saying that with hindsight because at the time I was probably a little bit open-minded. But in hindsight, looking at who we might have picked up, we need midfielders, right? So you apply that logic here again, and trading out of the top 3, while it is an even draft, we won't necessarily need to have pick 3. I still think there's about 5, 6, 7, 8 genuine midfielders that I want us to have access to. And while it's too early to know exactly how the draft board is going to land on draft day, I do get the sense that if we enter the draft at 10, 11, 12, hypothetically, a lot of the genuine midfielders at that point are off the board. So there might not be a talent gap between, say, a Sid Draper and a Toby Travalia. But Toby Travalia is at the moment a running defender, wingman who could be a midfielder. And for where we're at, I suppose what we'd be giving up is the way I'd phrase it. What we'd be giving up is a more locked-in, genuine midfielder at the next level. Whereas if we split the pick, if we take a Bo Allen, we take a Travalia, even a Xavier Lindsay, you could possibly say falls into this category. Do they become genuine on-ballers? So that is my biggest hesitation with trading out of the top 3. It's not so much talent. I think if you can get a couple of picks in the top 20, if we were in a different list position, if we had our midfield set, I'd say go for it. But that is the one thing we'd be giving up at this point in time. So let's go through some draft prospects that a bunch of these are likely to be available if we hold pick 3 at the draft, which of course becomes pick 4, assuming Levi Ashcroft goes in the top couple of picks. So that's all academic as to how that actually plays out. But we need to keep in mind, we're talking about live picks here. So you can remove Lombard, you can remove a Levi Ashcroft. Then there's also a couple of considerations like Luke Traynor and Harry Armstrong, probably the 2 talls at this point that could feature in that top 8 picks or so. I know that Traynor is supposedly falling down the order. Harry Armstrong is bolting. And then I saw The Age did a phantom draft where they have Alex Toru talked about as the top 5 prospect. So that is actually kind of a good thing. While I would love to have Toru, if we have 2 picks in the teens or something like that, if that's no longer realistic, it's actually good for us if a team ahead of us picks a key back, because it makes one of these midfielders more likely to be available for us. So let's go through some names. Jagger Smith, Harvey Langford, Sam Lawler. Now, that's 3 gun players that could possibly, on talent, go top 3 outside of Levi Ashcroft. It seems like Jagger's going to go pick 1 at this point, but it is still pretty open. It's no guarantee of that at all. So we'll include him in this. We'll include him in the group of mids that we want some access to. At least we want one of these players. So Jagger Smith, Langford, Lawler. There's Sid Draper. I read in the Age Phantom Draft that they released, I think they consulted 12 list managers or recruiters from 12 different clubs to formulate this Phantom based on consensus opinion and stuff like that. However, it does say the West Coast do like Sid Draper, so that's kind of the first early indication of someone we're looking at this draft. Finn O'Sullivan is a player that I still like, and I think he would still be a good addition for us. There's a couple of players, Murphy Reed and Josh Smiley, who on talent would be good as well. Interestingly, in that Age Phantom Draft, just as a side note, they said that a lot of recruiters thought Murphy Reed might be a little bit small to be a midfielder, and they might see him more as a forward at the next level, which will impact his draft rating. But in terms of what he's done, in terms of his form lines, he'd still be in that mix. However, I have heard through the grapevine that Reed and Smiley are less likely to want to leave Victoria. However, in that group, there is a lot of established midfield talent without too much doubt that these guys are midfielders at the next level. So I just wanted to highlight those guys as someone I'd love to have access to. So is there a scenario where we trade down from pick 3, but if we hold a pick in the first, say, 8 selections, bearing in mind 2 of those are Lombard and Ashcroft, we could still, in theory, get one of those players and an extra talent. And given the evenness of that group, maybe that's better. So with that being all said, just lay some context as the group of players I didn't really want to trade out of. Let's go through who some of the contenders might be for a team to trade with. So the first, most obvious one is Richmond. Now, at the end of the trade period, they're expected to hold picks 6, 10, 14, and 18. So 6 for Rioli, 10 and 18 for Bolton, and 14 from us for Liam Baker. So I've put 14 in brackets in my notes because that will get messy. If it comes to us, it could go there and then come back to us. How does that work? You could separate this as a couple of different deals. So let's say, and again, I don't want to make it sound like I'm happy to give up pick 14 for Baker. I think I've been fairly exhaustive on that. I'm pretty keen not to give up pick 14. However, if we can do a pick swap around this, it might work out for the best. So let's just say pick 14 for Liam Baker. I would be pushing for 32 back from Richmond in that case. 14, I still think, given his out-of-contract status, is probably, as a straight swap, I think that's us being about as generous as Richmond could have possibly hoped. I'd be hoping to push back for 32 coming back our way. So let's say we pull that off, and it's Baker and 32 for pick 14 in this year's draft. We could then look at giving them 3 and 26 for 6 and 14. So some might argue that 3 on its own could get 6 and 14. I'm a little bit skeptical about that. Given the evenness of the talent pool, I don't think Richmond's going to be tempted to trade 6 and 14 for pick 3. In other years, that might be the case. In this year's case, I think it's less necessary. I think Melbourne did a crazy trade to move up like 2 spots in last year's draft. You're not going to see that this year, in my opinion. So if I was optimistic giving us Baker and 32 for 14, perhaps I even it up a little bit by going pick 3 and 26 for 6 and 14. So essentially that would be us giving up pick 3 and 26 for Liam Baker, 6, 14, and 32. In this scenario, we still hold a top 6 pick in this year's draft to get one of those midfielders that I, ideally would like to have access to. We then also get pick 14, which is still a nice, really part of the draft. We keep that pick. We also hold 32. 32 is still a decent pick in this year's draft from what I've read. And then after that, it's 62 and 64. So that's 5 selections, 3 in the top 32, and then a couple of later ones. It is also possible that the Tom Barras deal, which will likely happen before this, you'd imagine. We don't know exactly how that's going to go. It could be 14 and 30 something from Hawthorn, which would give us 4 picks in the top 32. So that's not a bad outcome. 2 first rounders, 2 second rounders, and then a couple of late picks in the 60s. And we make the decision to pick one of those, depending on how deep this draft is rated, and B, how many list spots we've got. So that's one realistic option, which I don't think is screwing over Richmond, and I don't think is screwing us over either. Like I said, getting Liam Baker at this point of his career when he's not a free agent is just a shitty time for us. I'd rather be prioritising the draft. But in this case, we still hold 2 first rounders and don't give up a whole lot by moving from 3 to 6. Let's explore some other options, though. St Kilda could be an option. I did read that they're potentially open to moving up to, the top handful of picks in the draft. They're looking to replenish their midfield. Now with Josh Battle leaving, they hold picks 7 and 8 in this year's draft. So one potential option is pick 3 and 14 for 7 and 8. Now, I don't like that at all. I think we should say no to that. It would also just make the Liam Baker deal way more complicated, because while I don't love giving up 14 in a trade for Liam Baker, we also don't really have any other assets that make sense, really. So that would probably make that unnecessarily complicated. What you could do is try and push for 3 and 26 for 7 and 8 from St Kilda. Now that probably St Kilda should say no to that. 3 and 26 for 7 and 8, again, considering the lack of gap in the talent, unless there's somebody St Kilda really wants, and perhaps it could happen as a live trade, but unless St Kilda really wants someone in that top 3 or 4 group of players, which is possible, I think they'd probably tell us to F off if we offered 3 and 26 for 7 and 8 in this year's draft with the specific composition of talent and the tiers of talent. So look, would I do 3 and 26 for 7 and 8? Yeah, I would. However, it doesn't seem likely to me, and 3 and 14 for 7 and 8, it would just be complicated and also probably not a whole lot in it for us. If we're trading 3 down to 7, well, there's a chance we miss out on some of the midfielders we want, and is 8 that much better than 14 in this year's draft if we've already picked a midfielder? I'm not convinced by that. GWS is another team that's reportedly interested in moving up the order. It doesn't specifically say to West Coast, but naturally we would be a contender if they're looking to get really high up this draft order. Now, after the free agency compo picks dropped, GWS have, a whole slew of draft picks. So they hold specifically 15, 16, and 21. Now, if they want to get their grubby little orange hands on pick 3, I think it's going to cost them all 15, 16, and 21. Is that good for us? Probably not. Like, do we want to be picking as late as 15, even though it's 3 draft picks that are good? Like I said, you're getting removed from that top group of midfielders here. So again, I would defer to West Coast's recruiters, and they may have a very different assessment of where the midfield talent is in this year's draft. But even though it's a couple extra picks, 15, 16, and 21 for pick 3, I feel like it's a deal that both teams would find gross, to be honest. Which means it's probably fair, but it might not be aligned with what either club is trying to do this offseason. Alternatively, what GWS could do is package, say, 15 and 16 to another team that holds a top 10 pick and, say, get pick 8. 15 and 16 for pick 8, whoever that is. In this case, it's actually St Kilda, but I'm speaking hypothetically here. 15 and 16 to say, St Kilda for 8. They could then offer us 8 and 21 for pick 3. Now that's not too bad, because then, you know what I'd do? I'd try and push pick 21 to Richmond for Liam Baker. Now, this is slightly unders, perhaps. 14 is slightly overs. So, as Eagles fans, we would rather our club push for 21 for Liam Baker. Now, if that happened, that would be a pretty sweet deal. Now, in that scenario, we'd hold pick 8, we'd hold on to pick 14, and we'd hold 26. So, it's possible. It would require, a pretty audacious move from GWS to make it happen. It depends what their assessment is of the top few picks in this draft and whether they'd be a flight risk going to Sydney. There's so many different factors here, but technically, that is an option. And finally, Melbourne and Essendon are 2 other clubs that technically have the collateral to make this happen. So, starting with Melbourne, they will hold picks 5 currently, and they will get what will become pick 28 for Alex Neil-Bullen. That is the reported trade. So, if they're keen to move up to 3, which may or may not happen, and this could be a live trade again, if there's somebody they really want to get their hands on, would they trade 5 and 28 for 3? I mean, I probably would do that, but is there enough in there for Melbourne to do that? We saw last year, like I said, they made some really audacious moves to pick at 6 and 11 to take Windsor and Tholstrup. They traded a whole heap of other picks at, to be honest, not good value to just move up a few picks. But this is a different draft, so we need to assume that they'd have the same assessment of the top picks. They really need to have a guy that they want to be willing to trade 5 and 28 up for 3. It could happen, but I think that suits us. Another pick in the top 30 of this year's draft really helps us, I'd say. So I would do that, but I don't think it's likely. And then there's Essendon, who have 9 and 31. No indication they're trying to get a top 3 pick or anything like that, but technically 9 and 31 on value. Oh, no, actually, I hate it. But they're probably the next best option. That's a fair bit worse from 5 and 28, isn't it? I wrote it down as an option, but I do hate it. Unless, they upgraded our second to their future first. That could be an option. But we're just spitballing at this point, completely hypothetical. So there you have it, guys. That is my take on some of the ways this could happen. Obviously, it's all pretty academic at this point because a lot of these players have still got to switch clubs and we'll get different draft hands and there's different options. And I think that the point at which you have to stop trading picks is later than the trade period. So the trade period ends, players can't switch clubs, but then there's a few weeks up until the draft where clubs can still swap picks. Then there's a deadline until the draft and live trading resumes. So there's a lot to play out here. But I think, maybe trading pick 3, particularly in that Richmond scenario or that GWS scenario, or that St Kilda scenario actually, if we can get something done in this space and hold a couple of first round picks, even if 3 becomes 6, 7 or 8, then I think we can walk away with that pretty happy. But let me know in the comments what you think of my ideas, and yeah, up the Eagles. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.